Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a prominent state Democrat joining the fight against the new state income tax that could hit high earners in the next few years. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about who's joining the fight, a little bit about their history, and why this really matters?
Yeah, so the person who's joining in this legal effort is Phil Talmadge. He is a prominent Democrat who is a former Washington State Supreme Court justice, but he was also a state senator and he was a chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So he's also I've never heard this term before because I'm not in the legal world, but he's been selected as a super lawyer in Washington State numerous times, and this is and so it just goes to show the pedigree that he has legally coming into this legal fight. So that's it's really interesting because the legal team also has former State Attorney General Rob McKenna. So you have a former state attorney general and a former state Supreme Court justice in this legal fight against the income tax. So we're we're really seeing like this is kind of like the 1920 for people who love baseball, the 1927 Yankees or Murderers Row, or you know, you're seeing the top game legally coming to fight this income tax.
We're seeing players from both sides of the aisle. McKenna was a
Right.
Republican, Talmadge a Democrat. I mean, a super attorney. It seems like we're gearing up for what could be a super suit. I believe in your article you mentioned that Talmadge he has weighed in on an income tax in the past. We know this has been on the ballot. I want to say 10 times over the last 100 years
Yeah.
in Washington State. Most recently, around 2010 or so. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how he ruled at the time?
I mean, so is going as far back as 1933, and I was actually kind of surprised. Talmadge did a analysis of a initiative 1098 from 2010 that would have created a graduated income tax, and it was. I think it's worth bearing in mind how overwhelmingly that in 2010 that initiative was rejected by voters. It was rejected in almost every single precinct in the entire state. There was maybe a handful of precincts in Seattle, like the bluest of the blue accepted voted in favor of this. Everyone else voted against it. So he actually went back as far as 1930. There was a case called Aberdeen Savings and Loan Association v. Chase that is declaring income to be property, and that's going to be the key point or contention that's going to be in this case. So yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that ruling? Because people hear, "Oh, the income tax is unconstitutional. It's written black and white in the Constitution," but it wasn't in the Constitution in its original form. It came about in 1930, and now this is really the law of the land and what Democrats are hoping the precedent that they hope to overturn should this hit the Supreme Court later this year or next year. Why don't you tell us about that ruling?
So this is going to be probably one of the most important Supreme Court rulings when if this lawsuit is launched, which is undoubtedly is going to be, because what it's going to get at is the question of whether income is property, and it is almost impossible to argue that it's not for various reasons. Because what they did in the 30s is they wanted to shift the property tax burden away from land and onto other forms of property, but they wanted to tax them at different rates because a property tax is going to be is going to have a different rate than an income tax. So they passed a constitutional amendment. It's the 14th Amendment to the Washington State Constitution, very different from the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And it said that all forms of property are to be taxed at a uniform rate depending on their class. And they define properties, all things tangible and intangible, subject to ownership. So the only way that and what this does, it's important to note, is it makes an income tax by itself, it's constitutional. That's why they passed the voters pamphlet from 1933 or 1930 literally says the argument in favor of the amendment says we want this and we need this so that we can tax income at a different rate than land. And so what they would have to argue, the Supreme Court, in order to say that a progressive income tax is legal, is to say that income is not property. And I talked to a tax attorney probably 10 years ago about this, and he said if the state Supreme Court argued that income is not property under the definition in the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, then it cannot be stolen. Like the legal implications of that are are overwhelming, and I'd be interested in hearing what the arguments are going to be made in front of the Supreme Court, particularly about Talmadge because he used to sit on it. But that's going to have to be their question: is income property? Do you own your income? And I'm the legal argument to say that you don't, and I'm sure that somebody's going to try and say that we're not taxing your money, we're taxing the transfer of money, which they call, they did that with the capital gains excise tax or income tax, which they
Mhm.
call an excise tax, but it's an income tax. And that's how they got around not having to address the issue of whether income is property. With this bill, with this law, they can't get around that. The Supreme Court will have to address the question of whether or not income is property. So having Rob McKenna, having Phil Talmadge on this legal team, you're going to have people who are as well versed in the constitutional history, not to mention the fact that the Supreme Court of the state has unanimously, consistently over the last 80, 90 years said that income is property. So this Supreme Court's going to have to explain why 90 years of legal precedent was wrong. So that is the stakes that are at play here with this lawsuit, this impending lawsuit.
Yeah, and we're talking 90 to 100 years, coming up on 100 years of this legal precedent, deeply rooted in our state's history and constitution at this point. But at the same time, Washington, until this income tax takes effects in the coming years, it's one of, I believe, around 8 or 10 states across the country that does not have an income tax yet. Many of the states that do have an income tax do not treat income as property. I mean, how could that impact this fight? I know Washington State is different than those, but since other states don't consider income as property, could that play a role in the Supreme Court's decision when they take up this case?
The problem is that our Constitution has the broadest definition of property, and this was acknowledged in the original 1933 uh, uh, decision that overturned a progressive income tax that was passed by the state. They just said we have the broadest definition of property you could possibly imagine. There is no way that income cannot fall underneath this definition. And if and I think that that's a problem is that they got to get around the Constitution. They can't cite other states' legal precedents because it's not applicable because they don't have our Constitution. They don't have our definition of property,
Mhm.
and they also don't have the uniform clause when it comes to property uh, classes. So our property taxes have to be the same no matter where you are in the state as far as rates are concerned. That may not be the case in other states, but they're not ruling on other what they unlike our fuel efficiency standards of that advanced clean trucks and advanced clean cars policies. We can't adopt policies from other states and say that that applies to us. The state Supreme Court has to look at the Washington state constitution and say, okay, either income is property underneath this definition or it's not. And if it's not, we have to explain why. And they have to say
Mhm.
subject to and yeah, it doesn't say explicitly that you own your income, but then the question is who does own your income? And if
Mhm.
nobody owns it, then nobody can steal it. I mean, that's that would mean that somebody could go steal the income of the state Supreme Court justices, and it wouldn't be considered theft because it's not property. I mean, can you imagine the legal fight that would ensue if somebody stole their money and said it's income and it's not property? Like that, and that would raise other questions of what's the difference between wealth and income in that sense. So,
Mhm.
yeah, and I'm sure that some people will say, well, here's the legal difference. There's wealth, that's what you own, income, what you earn, wealth is what you already have. I get that, but this just raises this would open up uh the legal discussion to I think they would also have to explain why the other Supreme Court just prior Supreme Courts were wrong. I think that's they got 90
Mhm.
years of saying, yeah, they said this for 100 years and here's why we think they're wrong. Here's something we discovered that's new and changes everything in that regard. This is where it's going to be very fascinating to have a former state Supreme Court justice on not on the bench, but sitting in front of them and probably knowing I would dare to say probably knowing as much, if not more, than they probably know on this topic because he's written about it so
Mhm.
extensively And it's obviously he's getting involved because he wants to be involved in this legal fight. And so that's going to be a very different, I'd say, oral argument if he's going to participate in that.
Mhm. This is definitely a very pivotal moment in state history and in our state's tax structure. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. We're talking about this legal challenge that's building up, potentially to hit the Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the income tax. But at the same time, we have efforts trying to get it on the ballot. I mean, the Democrats wrote in this clause that makes it quote unquote referendum proof, so voters can't take it to the ballot to potentially reject it before it takes effect. And it is supposed to take effect in 2028, with first payments being in 2029. But a lot of moving parts here. The Supreme Court could weigh in as soon as the end of this month on potentially whether or not we could see this hit a referendum. That would require about 145 or 150,000 signatures before June 10th for that to go on a future ballot. But even at that point, if voters approve it and it stays in place or rejects it, the Supreme Court could then come in later and rule on this case that Talmadge is joining with McKenna and others to challenge the constitutionality. So, I mean, even if voters do approve it in that off chance, I mean, we saw overwhelming opposition when there was hearings in the state legislature. So we'll see how that turns out if it does land on the ballot. But if the Supreme Court rules against it, we could have another situation where, say, when the income tax first came on the ballot, prior to 1930, voters actually passed it before the state Supreme Court came in and said, no, this isn't going to work. And they overturn that. But definitely interesting to see how this will all play out in the coming months and years. I mean, TJ, how long do we expect this lawsuit challenging the constitutionality? How long do we expect this to take before we see a Supreme Court decision? Could it be months, or are we talking
I mean,
years?
that's gonna be the question is how long this fight's gonna play out and how long they're gonna wanna kick the can down. I think the biggest question is who's gonna wanna drag this out longer than the other. Because once there's a ruling, you know, that all bets are off as far as either way. But I'd say that I think it's interesting that the legislature decided to have the tax take effect as far as collecting the revenue for several years. And so that would indicate one could argue that indicates that they aren't as confident in it being upheld as they would otherwise think. Because if they
Well,
knew for sure it was going to be upheld, one could argue that they would have just said, you know what, let's immediately start collecting the tax. It's going to get
mhm.
upheld, no worries. Either that, or they're trying to figure out what the effect is going to be on people. I've written stories and others with our news organization on how people with wealth and income are leaving the state. And I don't mean in a literal sense. What they're doing is they're shifting their state residency to other states that have no income tax and don't have a wealth tax or an estate tax. And so, they'll stay in the state for 5 months. Then 6 months later, when it's about to be 6 months, they'll go somewhere else and live there for the rest of the year. And the state's not going to get the revenue it wants. And so the question is, how long does the tax on millionaires remain a tax only on millionaires?
Mhm, and we know that Democrats, repeatedly throughout the legislative session, were hesitant, did not say whether or not they would lower that threshold in future legislatures, saying they didn't want to construe, those legislatures. But TJ, thank you for diving into this. This will definitely be something that we put a lot of focus on in the coming months and years. And for those hoping to read TJ's stories, you can catch it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.